Hi, everyone. This is Logan Bayroff, Director of Communications at J Street, and we are really excited to be joined once again by Tal Schneider, diplomatic and political correspondent at Globes, for an Israeli election update. Hi, Tal. Thanks for being here.
Sure. Hi. Nice to be here again.
So it's been a busy time for the elections. We're now in that mode where we start shifting from the speculation mode into the actual campaign mode, as we saw the lists finalized last week. So after all the speculation about mergers and partnerships and coalitions, we see who's actually going to run together and who's not. So looking at what happened with the formulation of the lists as we pull up on the screen, sort of the major blocks that we're seeing form and how many seats they won in the last election, what struck you as really important and interesting here, Tal? What were the alliances that formed that you think are significant, and were there any that didn't form that you think are significant?
Hi, thanks for having me again. Yes, I think all across the board, from all political sides, the meaning of the higher threshold, the 3.25%, which is obviously at least 4 seats in the Knesset, the meaning and understanding of that high threshold has finally sat down on the political actors' mind. They understood that it's a huge gamble to try and get through that threshold if you are a small to even a medium list. Because even if you're a medium list, you can fall down under the threshold. So you saw in the Arab society, you see all of those 4 different parties joining together back to the situation they had in 2015. That's obviously the joint list. And then on the right wing, I go all the way down to the new right. In your table, it's mentioned as the new right, but obviously it's the number 5 in the 21st Knesset. It's actually the Beit Yehudi, the Jewish home, and the Ichud Leumi, the national unity. Those two together, Rafi Peretz and Smotrich, who are now ministers in Israel government and cabinet, they managed to bring in 5, whereas their colleagues, Ayelet Shaked and Naftali Bennett from the Yemin Hadash, the new right, stayed out with very close numbers to the threshold. So these 4 leaders, again, Naftali Bennett, Ayelet Shaked, Bezalel Smotrich, and Rafi Peretz, I know those names doesn't necessarily mean a lot to you, but this is the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Transportation and Justice, maybe next time. They came in together and they had 5 in the outgoing Knesset, but according to the polls, they may have even 10, 11, or 12 seats. This unification included Otzma Yehudit in the last election. Otzma Yehudit is the Kahanist Kach, the pupils of the Rabbi Kahana, group that was outlawed in Israel and was declared as a terror organization in the United States. They are running under a different name, not Kach or Kahana. They're running under Otzma Yehudit. Number 2 on that list, Ben Ari, who is not allowed to enter the US because he's part of a terror organization, he was disqualified by Israel's Supreme Court in April, and now he is not running. Otzma Yehudit was trying to be part of this new right, they call it now the United Big Right or something like that. They were trying to negotiate with him to enter him into their list. Netanyahu was heavily involved in promoting his candidacy. He was doing it, I think maybe you're all aware of this story. He was doing it in April. I'm talking about the Prime Minister. And he was doing it yet again this time, but this time unsuccessfully. The reason, probably what we heard behind the scene, was that actually Naftali Bennett, the former education minister, didn't want to have him inside. The meaning of this, split is that Otzma Yehudit, headed by Itamar Ben-Gvir, is still running for the Knesset, for the election. They may generate, I don't know how many, maybe one seat or 2 seats, between 1 and 2. Those numbers will not enter the Knesset, because you need at least 4, and therefore the result will be a waste of ballots for the right wing side. Another politician from the right wing is Moshe Feiglin, again with liberal agenda, right wing liberal agenda. He's running again, and this may cause the right wing another seat or so. We don't know yet. Yesterday there was a story here in the news that Netanyahu is trying to convince him to drop his bid in exchange for a title or a job, or maybe in exchange for covering of his big debts that he carries from the first election in 2019. The Labor, I'm going back to the left, the Labor combined Orly Levy. She's another politician who did not cross the threshold. She's the daughter of the former foreign affairs minister, a social activist, very devoted to social issues. It's a very nice combination, because she's coming from the right wing and she's joining the Labor. Yet with this joining, the Labor numbers in the polls do not show positive forecasts. The big 2 parties, Likud and Blue and White. So Likud have pulled in the finance minister, Moshe Kahlon. Moshe Kahlon had his own party in the last 2 terms. The name of the party was Kulanu. He had 10 seats, and then he had only 4 seats. He is a Likudnik in his origins. Netanyahu just brought him back in. So that means there is no social, in the center of the map, there isn't any social party who is, maybe right-wing, moderate right-wing.
Right.
There is only the Labor, who is, social, but a bit more to the left. So you don't have in the center that, and so this is the Likud. An important note to see about this union: the Likud had 35 seats, like it's written here on the board, and Kahlon had 4 seats. Together, it's 39. Yet the polling at the moment show around 30 to 31 for the Likud. The meaning, of course, is that the people that were followers or supporters of Moshe Kahlon probably did not follow his steps and enter the Likud at the moment. It's yet to be seen. Blue and White is obviously we call it the party of the generals. It's the former IDF chiefs, Ya'alon, Benny Gantz, and Ashkenazi. They're running in team with Yair Lapid, who is already a politician since 2012. They joined forces last February. They submitted exactly the same list without any additions or changes. And there's another interesting union on the left side. It's called the Democratic Union, 4 seats, but it's actually Meretz. Meretz is now headed by a different politician. His name is Nitzan Horowitz, and he joined forces with Israeli former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who is now at the age of 77, decided to jump right in, and he is placed at number 10 on that list. The polls are showing between 7 to 8 seats. So that means that Barak is not necessarily going to be an MK in the next Knesset.
So thanks for that overview, Tal. You spoke earlier this week or last week to the New York Times, and you talked about how with this election, sort of as we saw with the last one, when we go to Election Day on September 17th, that's sort of only one stage in the real battle, because the real battle may actually come after that, when you then have the parties negotiating to try to form a government. And as we saw in April, they weren't able to do so in a way that satisfied Netanyahu, at least, and so that's why we're in the new elections now. And you said, last time in April on election night, both Bibi and Benny Gantz gave victory speeches, and that if they're smart, this time neither of them will give a victory speech on election night. So could you say a little bit more about what you mean by that? And based on the blocks that you just laid out, what are we likely to see in terms of the negotiations that would come out of an election, since it seems very unlikely that anyone would be able to secure an outright majority just for a right-wing bloc or a left-wing bloc? What do you think that negotiations period as we stand now is likely to look like?
Okay, thank you. So first we have to say the election system in Israel is very different from the United States. We do not have a definite winner on election night. I know it's hard to understand, but we have, the process is all the way up to the election day, and then following the election, we have another process who is called coalition building. It's like in the UK, you have to form a coalition from different parties. It's a whole mini campaign because it is, it's without voting, but the representative, the MKs, the member of the Knesset, has to negotiate with each other and to reach an agreement, an understanding. And it has to be a written agreement, which is the foundation for the next government. So since you mentioned the victory night or the funny speeches night, I may also want to remind you about the May 29th night. This is the night where this 21st Knesset dissolved itself. And I read a tweet, or maybe I heard your president, President Trump, saying something of the sort, what's going on? Netanyahu is the winner. I do not understand why he's being dragged into a rerun. So please, it's not a rerun. It's not a rerun. It's not a second term. It's not correction, or it's not the same election. It's a different election. It's a whole new game. We do not have a definite winner on election night. Now, on April 9th, actually, what was funny is that according to the exit polls that were broadcasted on the TV, Benny Gantz, the chair of Kahol Lavan, thought he could form a coalition, and he ran to the place where Kahol Lavan, where blue and white were gathered, and he gave a winning speech. I think he wanted to give the message to the other party that he is forming the government because he has the numbers. He was immediately ridiculed, on that night and the following days, because obviously he did not have 61. We have 120 MKs, 120 members of the Knesset. You need at least 61, which is half plus one, to go to the president in a week following the election and recommend you to become the next prime minister. Now, Netanyahu had 61. He had more than 61, actually. And Netanyahu said immediately after the elections on that night, I'm already started the negotiation process. I have 61. And he gave his winning speech. So one party that actually recommended Netanyahu that night and was misleading the public was Avigdor Lieberman, because he did recommend Netanyahu, but then you have to understand that after this recommendation process, you have to reach an agreement with Avigdor Lieberman. It's not enough that he recommends you. You also have to negotiate with him for a political agreement. Now, Lieberman said, I had full intention to recommend Netanyahu, but on the negotiation process, it was not, agreeing with me on my terms, and I'm allowed not to. I was chosen to get, what I want for the Israeli public.
Right.
And Netanyahu was not even. So, yeah, so I think on September 17th, both sides will be careful unless, of course, there will be a landslide. If Netanyahu will have a landslide, which means the Likud, Shas, United Torah, and Unified Right, if these four groups will be more than 61, then he can be declared maybe as almost the winner.
So let's talk a little bit more about Avigdor Lieberman, since he was kind of the key figure after the last election, as you just said. He has sort of been defining himself. He's a politician who comes from the right, and yet he's defined himself heavily in terms of his criticisms of the ultra-Orthodox parties and the question over the ultra-Orthodox in the draft. And he's been pretty critical recently of Netanyahu. Most recently, he's been talking about wanting to push for a unity government after the election. The idea that he might try to broker an agreement potentially with Likud and Blue and White that would leave out the ultra-Orthodox parties, perhaps. What do you think about that suggestion, the idea of a possible unity government? What do you think is the role that Lieberman is most likely going to want to play, after September 17th? And is there a realistic chance that he could sort of get what he wants here? Is he ultimately trying to play a bigger role in the next Netanyahu government, or do you think he sees a real chance to potentially help broker a new right-of-center government that would leave Bibi out?
So Avigdor Lieberman has been saying lots of things since May 29th. That's the day the 21st Knesset dissolved. At first, he defended himself and said, "Of course, I recommended Netanyahu because I'm a right wing, true to the values." But then he said Netanyahu was not able to negotiate with me, so this is the reason I did not enter the government. Since May 29th, his public comments evolved. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, he started to talk about unity government. Now he says, before we go to the president to recommend anyone, I will conduct my own mini recommendations campaign in which I will ask both Likud and Blue and White, are you going to sit together with each other? And only the party that will promise me that they will work towards unity, this is the party that, even further than that, he said, the first leader of a party that will come to me and will promise me that he is going to make a unity government, this will be the one that I recommend to the president. The true meaning of the things is that he may come to the president and recommend Benny Gantz. This is the way the Likud is now understanding this. They keep trashing him and saying suddenly Lieberman is the lefty, Lieberman is a traitor and whatever, because he's recommending the left, the Benny Gantz. I have to also add that Lieberman is a seasoned and experienced and well-known politician in Israel. And he's not well-known for being trustworthy, which means he has changed his mind about things in the last decade. He said so many things before he became defense minister, only to become a defense minister and not fulfilling any one of them. He has famous statements declaring A, but then doing B. So, Israeli voters, I think, fully aware of this problem and the level of trustworthiness at the moment. For example, Netanyahu keeps saying, I will never go for a unity government, but then just 2 months ago, on May 29th, he negotiated with the Labor. Lieberman says, I will only go for a unity government, but then, according to his history, it's not something that you can really trust or build from. As per Gantz, per Blue and White, people are, they're not they're not here longer enough to really understand how he, Benny Gantz, and the rest of the group are behaving as politicians. Because overall, people do not believe politicians in Israel. If you promise something and then you do not stand for your promises, it's not something punishable or in any way even not condemnable here in Israel.
Right.
So the second part was about the participation of the ultra-Orthodox. Personally, I think none of the Israeli next government will exclude them. I don't believe Lieberman that he will sit without ultra-Orthodox. I think he's just saying it for the campaign. If he wants a unity, he can always add in at least one of them, probably Shas, who is the sporadic party, and you can have them with the unity government if that's the case.
So even if Netanyahu potentially was willing to consider a unity government, one of the problems that we see with that option is that Blue and White has indicated in the past they would be maybe willing to sit in a government with Likud, but not with Netanyahu as prime minister. And so that then starts to raise the question of, is there any circumstance in which Likud would ever remove Netanyahu, move to a new leader who might be able to form a new government with Blue and White or with others? And sort of in response to that question, Netanyahu seems to be continually, at least a little bit worried about that threat, because now we see him pushing his own party members, everyone on the Likud slate, to agree basically to a loyalty pledge to say, I will only accept Netanyahu as the leader of my party as the prime minister after the next election. So what do you make about that, the dynamics around that question, this this loyalty pledge, and the idea of whether there might try to be, some sort of version of a government with Likud minus Netanyahu?
So thank you for the question. First, the loyalty pledge has no meaning whatsoever. It is not legal binding. It is just sort of it's not a hoax. It's really happened. I think Lieberman was playing with the Likud. He was trying to play with their mind, and they just ate the debate.
Yeah.
Debate very quickly. You do not need loyalty pledge for the members of your party. Your party bylaws or the party's constitution declare that the chairman of the party is the one to be recommended anyways.
Right.
And when it comes to raise your hand at the Knesset, each Knesset member has his own discretion and he can do whatever he wants without any sanction from the Likud leader. So if they want to, if there will be a decision, for example, to vote Netanyahu off by the Likud members, they can do it, but they don't want to do it because Netanyahu is very strong politically. So it's not something that's unlikely to happen. So when Blue and White are talking about negotiation with the Likud only and not with Netanyahu, it's a huge problem. It seems unlikely, an unlikely scenario. Having said that, if Benny Gantz is coming up with enough recommendations, because as we said before, maybe Lieberman is jumping to the other side, then Benny Gantz, and this is again, right now it seems like an unlikely scenario because we don't know the number yet, but let's say theoretically, if Benny Gantz is the one who is receiving the mandate from the president, he can come up to some Likudniks and say, join me into my government. But if Netanyahu is the one who is getting the mandate, then I do not see a way forward with this kind of letting him go. It's not going to work. Also, please take into account that the recommendation process takes a week. So election is on September 17th. Then on 24 or 25, we'll start the negotiation process. Then we have Rosh Hashanah, the New Year's Eve, right? It's falling in the midst of everything. And then on October 2nd, if Netanyahu, for example, get the mandate, he has the mandate for 28 days, I think. So 28 days will start counting from September 25th. Then Rosh Hashanah, then on October 2nd, the Attorney General is conducting the hearing for the prime minister in 3 criminal cases. And after that, on October 4th, the negotiation are supposed to continue. This is a very tricky and complicated situation, whereas all of your negotiation partners know that you are on lifeline.
Right.
And the Attorney General said it specifically. He is not going to postpone this date. It's not going to change, and it doesn't care how many election cycles we are into. So
right.
This is like a fixed date. It's not going to change.
So I want to remind people, first of all, that they can submit questions via the Q&A function that you'll see towards the bottom of your screen. And I want to take a question that we've gotten about some of the movement on the left. So, there's been a lot of speculation about whether Meretz would form a coalition with Labor. There was speculation about what Ehud Barak would do. And obviously, as you talked about, the outcome that we ended up seeing is that you have this new entity with a new Meretz leader and Ehud Barak, the Democratic Union. And then you had Labor pairing up with Orly Levy. What are your thoughts on sort of where the left is likely to go now? Could this be one of the first elections where the Meretz bloc actually ends up getting more seats than the Labor bloc, which has traditionally been sort of the center? Labor has been the forefront of the center left. Are there different voter bases that Labor's alliance and the Democratic Union are trying to appeal to? And is one of them more likely the future of the left than the other?
Okay. First, I think there was high expectations from Labor and Meretz to join forces. The fact that this did not happen, even with Orly Levy in, there was still a chance for the Labor with Orly Levy, she's coming from the right wing, there was still expectation for the Labor to join forces with Meretz, because the differences between Meretz and Labor are not big at all. And people thought that with this high threshold, these two parties should work together. And when Amir Peretz who's now the chair of the Labor, I think he's the eldest MKs, and he was also the defense minister, and he held many jobs. He's one of the elders. When Amir Peretz refused altogether to combine his political network with Meretz, that was a huge disappointment for the entire liberal left camp. So right now, what you see in the polls, and this may also happen in September 17th, I think lots of voters are punishing Amir Peretz and the Labor for not joining forces. You see Meretz with Ehud Barak, and by the way, Stab Shafir from the Labor, she joined them because she thought the unity is important. So you see a lot of voters are punishing Amir Peretz and the Labor for that, while trying to give credit for Nitzan Horowitz and Ehud Barak and Stab Shafir, who convinced the public that they were sincere about the unity, the unity efforts.
Right.
So this is one reason Labor may fall even under the threshold. This is crazy, but it's true. It may happen. If Labor falls behind the threshold, this is it's going to be a huge blow for the entire camp. You must understand, they may come up with 120,000 ballots, which is not enough to enter the Knesset. So the meaning is that 120,000 ballots may be just wasted, like it happened to the right wing in the first 2019 election. So right now, I think the effort is to have both Meretz and Labor crossing the threshold and not wasting any ballots. And Meretz with Barak are in a better position at the moment to maybe come up even above 8, maybe 9. And Labor is fighting for its life, but we are more than, I think, about 6 weeks away, maybe even 7 weeks away from the election. A lot of things can happen. We think August is kind of a dead, Israel is on a vacationing. There's no schools until September 1st. So things will pick up from September 1st. Up until September 1st, it's all kind of lame, and it's not really sure what's going on. I see someone here asked me about Avram Burg and Muhammad Darawshe. It's all, the lists are closed. Burg and Darawshe and maybe other politicians cannot join by now. Lists were finalized and closed last Thursday. So if they're not in at the moment, they will not take part of the 22nd Knesset.
So another question we received is about a party that we've talked about a bit, but in some ways has kind of flown under the radar during this negotiations period, which is Blue and White. They're heading into Kahol Lavan under Benny Gantz. They're heading into the elections with more or less the same alignment that they had in the last election. But the question was about, how is that alignment, that alliance of sort of Benny Gantz and the former IDF chiefs of staff with Yair Lapid and his Yesh Atid party, how is that holding up? Recently, we saw Yair Lapid, going aggressively in his criticisms of the ultra-Orthodox, which is something that he's done before. There's a question of whether that's something that might scare off or be, bothersome to other folks in the party. How do you see that sort of Kahol Lavan alliance holding up and going forward into the elections in September?
So I think it's true. They're having some problems. They're having some inner issues. You must understand their achievement in April was huge. 35 seats. This is something that the Israeli left or Israeli center left hasn't seen in decades. So the achievement was big. Instead of enjoying this huge achievement, and instead of going forward as a strong group, now they have lots of inner discussions and fallouts and arguments, and of course things are leaking out. Lapid, in the polls, they have polls showing 30 seats or so, the same numbers as the Likud, but what's causing this downward way is because Lieberman became really strong within seculars, because Lieberman took on the issues of Shabbat and of draft and equal rights for seculars and so on. So a lot of Blue and White supporters went to Lieberman. We see it all over we talk to people, we hear it all the time. People are, happy with him, and also people from the left and center. One of the most important things for them is just toppling Netanyahu. And now they believe that Lieberman will topple Netanyahu, and they are supporting him. So having said that, the party doesn't deal very good with that. They're not strong enough. They're not relevant. We're not hearing them. We're not seeing them. I think Yair Lapid decided to put out one of his sort of humoristic videos, which was taken by the ultra-Orthodox as an insult. And then Gantz came up and said, he didn't say it out loud, but he said it in a conversation, that this is against the party agenda. And what is their agenda? Their agenda is to be able to sit in one government with the ultra-Orthodox. Obviously, I think no one thinks that the ultra-Orthodox will ever recommend them or will ever want to sit with them. There is something that you must understand. Ultra-Orthodox in Israel historically has been, how do you say it? Like in Hebrew, we call it Lashon Maznayim. Historically, they were able to sit either with the left or with the right. But and for this reason, they were considered the constant players, because everybody were courting them. But what happened in the last decade is that they identify wholly and totally with the right wing. They have no interest whatsoever to be able to form a coalition with the Israeli left or center. So they are only with Netanyahu, and Netanyahu giving them his love back. So they're no longer this Lashon Maznaim, the tipping, and this left a vacuum in Israel's political map. And Lieberman very smartly entered into this vacuum, and he said, "I am the new." Again, I can't find the word in English for Lashon Maznaim.
Yeah, it's sort of the bellwether, the tipping point. Yeah,
balancing act. He declared himself as the new balancing act, which means that he can go with either side, and it's good for him. And Benny Gantz is trying to portray an image or a reputation of a leader who the ultra-Orthodox will embrace in the day following the election. This plan may not work for him, but at least he wants to maintain this kind of integrity. And for this reason, he did not like what Lapid is doing, but every day they have a sort of an inner fight. The fight is leaking to the press, and then they go out to an event and they hug each other and they shoot themselves as, the great buddies. It's a lot about game, I suppose.
Right. Another question as we head towards the end, another question we got was about what's happening with the Israeli Arab public. One of the seemingly big regrets after the last election was that the joint list that succeeded in 2015 under the leadership of Ayman Odeh of uniting sort of the four major Arab parties. In 2015, they became the third largest party in the Knesset. In the April 2019 election, they ran as two separate slates. They did not unify. And it seemed like that was one of the reasons why Arab turnout was low. The two parties, I think, combined finished with 10 seats instead of 13. For this election, they've now agreed to reform as the joint list. What is your general sense of their prospects in the election? There were continuing to be major concerns about Arab turnout. Is Arab voter turnout likely to be up now that the joint list has reformed? Or are there still concerns about a voter boycott or voters not turning out in the polls? Obviously, as we've talked about with the fine margins in terms of the parties making the threshold or not making the threshold, a high Arab voter turnout could also significantly impact the overall electorate and the composition of the Knesset. So what are your thoughts on what we're likely to see with the Israeli Arab vote in September?
Okay, so first, the voter turnout was under 50%, whereas the general voter turnout was 68%. So when I say 68%, it's also it includes all parts of society. So obviously, if you take apart the Jewish turnout, it is more than 68, obviously, right? So when the Arabs voter turnout is under 50, this is historically low. I mean, even for them, it's just historically low, and it was one of the big shames, I think, of the first election in 2019. And it's a big question how will their leaders will fix that. I'm not sure it's fixable on such a short term. I want to stress that we also had local elections at the end of 2018. And on the local elections, the Arab voter turnout is between 80% and 90%, wow. which means it's not about permanent political behavior. It's only about general elections. I think, overall, the Israeli Arab minority thinks that voting to the Knesset, it doesn't going to give them anything in return, and they just indifferent to this process. And it's something that the society needs to fix. But having said that, the Likud, which is the ruling party for the last, so many years, has been busy in what I call voter suppression.
Right.
It's, of course, they deny it. They claim, the Likud is claiming only to have a process in which they are worried about counterfeit and about violations, and therefore they apply this. They station a lot of um, inspectors or observers. Yeah. They only put observers in Arab villages and Arab communities. They do not worry about counterfeits in the entire Israeli society, but only in those Arab villages. This is what happened in the beginning in the first election we had. And another reason, like you mentioned, for the low turnout was the non-unification. So the fact that they were running apart. So there was a big dissatisfaction in the Israeli Arab public. So now so the Arab lists are already united themselves. So this part is fixed. I don't know if it will drive them out as much as they want. The other part about the inspectors, about the observers, we actually have a very, very interesting hearing tomorrow morning in Jerusalem, to which I plan to go and from which I plan to tweet. You may follow my Twitter account. I will tweet in English. It will start in our morning time, but it's going to be very, very interesting because you have lots of Israeli activists and civil organizations and parties that are planning to attend tomorrow hearing. It's one of the most important events, to my opinion, of this election, because the Supreme Court judge is going to rule whether the behavior of the Likud with stationing their inspectors, with putting cameras, they want to put cameras in the polling stations, not behind the curtain, but in the general polling station. If this anti-counterfeit, they call it anti-counterfeit or anti-violations organization, if this is legal or not. Lots of Israelis organizations think that this goes against the core values of the system, which is secretive elections. Obviously, a person who's going into the polls has his right for privacy. And if you put out there someone who is taking video or shots of him, this is a severe violation. We'll have to see tomorrow.
For everyone who wants to follow along with Tal, her Twitter handle is just @Tal Schneider, and it's some of the best timely coverage that we'll see of Israeli politics, so follow along with that tomorrow. Tal, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I want to wrap up with the last question, which is just moving on from sort of turnout in the Arab community, just talk about what is the overall attitude that you're seeing right now in the Israeli public towards this election. It's very unusual, or fairly unusual, to have an election so soon after one that just happened, to have an election in April and then another general election campaign in September. Are the voters paying close attention? Are we seeing enthusiasm, or is there fatigue that has set in with the electoral process after a year of so much politicking?
Yes, it is. We never had election in September in the country's history. Election usually take on during November or the winter time. This is a first. So with respect to voters' participation or voters' behavior, there's a whole, political science field out there. We do not know. It's a week before, or maybe 10 days before, as I said, the beginning of the high holidays. How many people are in the country? How many people are planning, to stay this September 17th, Tuesday, and not to take on their vacations already? How can you campaign during July and August, where literally no one is here? The kids are out of school, families. I think you have, Israel is about 9 million people. I think we have at least 1 million people that are out of the country at the moment.
Wow.
So I've interviewed Yair Lapid, the number 2 on Blue and White, and I asked him, how do you campaign? He said, no, how do you call it? Chugei Bayit, town halls, but here they do the town halls sometimes inside houses of people, like the Iowa caucuses when you have
Yeah,
this.
House meetings.
There's nobody's here. Nobody wants to hear the politicians. So he goes on the train from Tel Aviv to Akko, or from Tel Aviv to the deep south, and on the train he's doing his town hall. He
Wow.
walks from one carriage to another. He sits next to the people and he talks to them. He goes on the trains or on the buses, or there. This is so hot at the moment here. So everybody are inside the shopping malls where there is a heavy air condition.
Right.
So the politicians are just doing their rounds inside the shopping mall. There's no way to meet people on the streets, or have big conventions, big gatherings in the city, in open areas, because nobody wants to be out in the open. It's so hot. So I think it's very hard for the politicians at the moment to conduct a campaign. And we'll have to see on September. The voter turnout is a big issue. I suspect lots of people will not participate this time around. This is not beneficial for the left, or for the. It's crucial for the left because their big, voting chunk is in the big cities. It's inside Haifa or inside Tel Aviv, whereas Jerusalem and Beersheba are mostly more right-wing, but Tel Aviv is the biggest city. If Tel Aviv is not voting on September 17th, so probably Blue and White and other liberal groups are just, they're done. I mean, they need to have, a good voter turnout. We think that voter turnout on the ultra-Orthodox, for example, is fixed. It's going to be high anyways. So it can give the right wing a benefit moment. So we'll have to see.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be fascinating to see, and I just want to remind everyone that the timing of how this is likely to play out, by the time the election actually happens and the negotiations happen between the parties, will be towards the end of October, which is when the J Street conference will be taking place in Washington, D.C. If you haven't yet registered for the conference from October 26th to 29th, I'm sure one of the many topics we'll be talking about, in addition to how we continue to push back on the foreign policy of the Trump administration and prepare for our own election in 2020, is talking about the aftermath of this September Israeli election, what could be maybe the end of the Netanyahu era, or a continuation, or something that we just can't prepare for. So it's going to be a really exciting and important time to be gathering to discuss all this and talk about what's next. But I'm sure we'll also have opportunities to check in again with Tal before then. So thanks, Tal Schneider, so much for joining us. And folks, follow along here on Twitter. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Bye.